spooky place.
Have you ever felt the weight of a gaze that wasn't there? Or heard a whisper in the dark that made your blood run cold? Tonight, I invite you to step into the shadows of La Maison d'Ombres, where a cursed veil and a blood-stained dagger weave a tale of horror so chilling, you won't be sleeping soundly, if at all. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Red Light Phantom. The district was known as Black Hollow, a place where shadows clung to the cobblestone streets like a second skin. It was a place of vice and decay, where the air was thick with the stench of opium dens, cheap perfume, and desperation. Women had been vanishing for months. Prostitutes, beggars, even a seamstress who had wandered too far from the safety of the market. No bodies were ever found, no clues left behind. Just whispers of a wealthy man who appeared only at night, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, his presence as fleeting as smoke. One rainy evening, a new girl arrived in Black Hollow. Her name was Eliza, a runaway with nowhere else to go. She was young, with fiery red hair and a spirit that hadn't yet been broken by the world. She took up residence in a crumbling boarding house, where the other girls warned her to stay off the streets after dark. But Eliza was desperate for work, and desperation made her bold. It wasn't long before she heard the rumors. The wealthy man, the disappearances, the whispers of an abandoned brothel on the edge of town, a place that had burned down a century ago, but still stood, charred and skeletal, as if the flames themselves had been too afraid to finish the job. Eliza's curiosity got the better of her. She asked around, piecing together fragments of stories. The last person to see the missing women had been this mysterious man. He was said to be handsome, with a voice like velvet and eyes that glimmered like gold. But no one knew his name, where he lived, or even if he was real. Some claimed he was a ghost, others a devil. All Eliza knew was that he was her only lead. One night, she saw him. He emerged from the fog like a specter, his tailored coat brushing the ground, his gloved hands clutching a cane with a silver wolf's head. Eliza followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. He led her to the abandoned brothel, its windows shattered, its doors hanging off their hinges. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers began, soft, mournful cries that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Inside, the brothel was a labyrinth of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and the scent of rot and ash filled her nostrils. She followed the sound of the man's footsteps, deeper and deeper into the building, until she found herself in a grand ballroom. The ceiling was blackened, the chandeliers reduced to twisted metal, but the room was alive with movement. Shadows danced across the walls, their forms shifting and writhing like flames. And then she saw them, the women, dozens of them, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. They floated in the air, their tattered dresses billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. They were the missing women, their spirits trapped in this cursed place. They reached out to Eliza, their voices a chorus of anguish. "Run," they whispered. "He is not a man. He is hunger. He is death." Eliza turned to flee, but the doors slammed shut behind her. The wealthy man stood in the center of the room, his face now visible. His skin was unnaturally smooth, his lips curled into a cruel smile. His eyes glowed like embers, and when he spoke, his voice echoed with 1,000 whispers. "You should not have come here, little one," he said, "but now that you have, you will join them." He stepped closer, and Eliza realized with horror that his shadow did not match his form. It was a monstrous thing, with horns and claws and a gaping maw. He was no man. He was a demon, a creature that fed on lust and fear, on the souls of those who dared to cross his path. Eliza backed away, her mind racing. The spirits of the women swirled around her, their cries growing louder. One of them, A girl with dark hair and a scar across her cheek stepped forward. Her voice was clearer than the others. "The brothel is his prison," she said. "He cannot leave unless he consumes a soul. But if you destroy his anchor, you can trap him here forever." "What anchor?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. The girl pointed to the cane in the demon's hand. "The wolf's head. It holds his power. Break it, and he will be bound to this place." The demon laughed, a sound that made Eliza's blood run cold. "You think you can defeat me, child? I have walked this earth for centuries. I have devoured kings and beggars alike. You are nothing but a morsel." Eliza's fear turned to rage. She lunged for the cane, but the demon was faster. He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. His grip was like iron, his breath hot and foul. The spirits of the women screamed, their forms flickering like candle flames. But Eliza was not alone. The dark-haired girl's spirit surged forward, her ghostly hands grasping the cane. With a cry of effort, she wrenched it from the demon's grasp and threw it to Eliza. The demon roared in fury, his form shifting and twisting as he released Eliza and turned on the spirit. Eliza hit the ground hard, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cane and slammed it against the floor with all her strength. The silver wolf's head cracked, and a blinding light erupted from the cane. The demon howled, his body dissolving into smoke and ash. The walls of the brothel shook, the spirits of the women swirling around Eliza in a final, desperate embrace. When the light faded, the brothel was silent. The demon was gone, the cane reduced to a pile of dust. The spirits of the women were gone too, their faces peaceful as they faded into the afterlife. Eliza stumbled out of the brothel, her body bruised and her mind reeling. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking over Black Hollow. She knew the district would never be safe. There were other demons, other horrors lurking in the shadows. But for now, she had survived. As she walked away, she thought she heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Thank you." But when she turned, there was no one there. Just the brothel, standing silent and still, its secrets buried in the ashes. Eliza thought it was over. She thought the demon was gone, the spirits at peace, and the brothel just a crumbling relic of a nightmare best forgotten. But Black Hollow had a way of clinging to its horrors, and the deeper she tried to bury the past, the more it clawed its way back to the surface. Weeks passed, and Eliza tried to rebuild her life. She found work at a tavern, serving ale to men who leered at her, but dared not touch her. There was something about her now, a hardness in her eyes, a chill in her presence, that kept them at bay. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every night, as she walked home, the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, and the whispers of the wind sounded like the voices of the women she had freed. One evening, as she undressed for bed, she noticed something on her skin, a mark just above her heart, a faint, swirling pattern that looked like smoke trapped beneath her flesh. It hadn't been there before. She tried to scrub it away, but it only grew darker, more defined. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. That night, she dreamed of the brothel. She stood in the ballroom again, but this time, the women were not there to help her. They were screaming, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies dissolving into ash. The demon stood before her, his form more monstrous than before, a towering figure of shadow and flame, his eyes burning like twin suns. "You thought you could destroy me?" he hissed, his voice echoing in her mind. "You only set me free, and now you belong to me." Eliza woke in a cold sweat, the mark on her chest throbbing. She knew then that the demon was not gone. He was inside her, desperate for answers. Eliza sought out an old woman named Mother Agatha, a witch who lived on the outskirts of Black Hollow. The woman was feared by the townsfolk, but Eliza had nowhere else to turn. Mother Agatha's hut was filled with jars of strange herbs, animal bones, and candles that burned with green flames. When Eliza showed her the mark, the witch's face turned pale. "This is no ordinary curse," Mother Agatha said, her voice trembling. "The demon you faced was no mere spirit. He is Asmodeus, the Lord of Lust, and you have become his vessel. The mark is his sigil, a sign that he has claimed you. He will use your body to return to this world, and when he does, he will bring hell with him." Eliza's heart sank. "How do I stop him?" Mother Agatha hesitated. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. Asmodeus was bound to the brothel by a coven of witches centuries ago. They used a ritual to trap him, but it required a sacrifice, a living soul to anchor him to this world. When you broke the cane, you released him, but the anchor remains. To banish him for good, you must find the anchor and destroy it." "What is the anchor?" Eliza asked. "A child," Mother Agatha said. "A child born of Asmodeus's bloodline, hidden among the living. The witches kept the child's identity a secret, but the demon has been searching for them. If he finds the child, he will use their blood to complete his resurrection." Eliza's mind raced. "How do I find this child?" Mother Agatha handed her a small, ornate mirror. "This will show you the truth, but beware, the closer you get to the child, the stronger Asmodeus's hold on you will become. And if he takes control of your body, all is lost." Eliza began her search, using the mirror to guide her. It showed her glimpses of the child, a young girl with golden hair and eyes that glowed like the demon's. But the visions were fleeting, and each one left Eliza weaker, the mark on her chest spreading like a disease. As she searched, she began to notice strange things happening around her. People in the town would stare at her with vacant eyes, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. Shadows moved on their own, forming shapes that resembled the demon. And at night, she could hear his voice, whispering promises of power and pleasure if she would only give in. One night, as she followed a vision to an old church on the edge of town, she was ambushed. A group of townsfolk surrounded her, their eyes black as coal, their movements unnaturally fluid. They were no longer human. They were thralls, servants of Asmodeus. "The master has been waiting for you," one of them hissed, their voice a guttural growl. "He wants his vessel." Eliza fought back, using the mirror to reflect the light of the moon. The thralls shrieked and recoiled, giving her just enough time to escape. But she knew she was running out of time. The demon's influence was spreading, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. Finally, the mirror led her to an orphanage on the outskirts of Black Hollow. The child was there, a girl no older than 6, with golden hair and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. Her name was Lila, and she had no idea of the power she carried. Eliza approached the girl, her heart heavy with guilt. She had come to destroy the anchor, to kill an innocent child to save the world. But as she looked into Lila's eyes, she saw something else, a spark of defiance, a strength that reminded her of herself. "You're here to hurt me, aren't you?" Lila asked, her voice calm. Eliza shook her head. "No, I'm here to protect you." But before she could say more, the walls of the orphanage began to shake. The thralls had found her, and with them came Asmodeus, his form now fully materialized, a towering figure of shadow and flame, his eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot win, little one," the demon snarled. "The child is mine, and so are you." Eliza stood between the demon and Lila, the mark on her chest burning like fire. She knew what she had to do. She raised the mirror, focusing all her will on the child. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The mirror shattered, and a blinding light filled the room. Eliza felt the demon's presence surge within her, his laughter echoing in her mind as he took control of her body. But she had one last trick. She plunged a shard of the mirror into her own heart. The light exploded outward, consuming the thralls, the orphanage, and the demon. When it faded, Eliza was gone, and Lila was left standing alone. The mark on her chest now faded to a faint scar. But as the townsfolk began to rebuild, whispers spread of a new figure in Black Hollow, a woman with fiery red hair and eyes that glowed like embers. Some said she was a hero, others a monster. But one thing was certain: the Devil's Brothel was no longer abandoned. And deep within its walls, a new demon waited, her laughter echoing through the halls. The Dollhouse. The city was a labyrinth of neon and shadows, and in its heart stood the opulent brothel known as La Maison des Étoiles. From the outside, it was a beacon of elegance, its windows glowing with a soft, golden light that promised indulgence and escape. Inside, the walls were adorned with gilded mirrors, the floors covered in plush crimson carpets, and the air thick with the scent of jasmine and something metallic, faint but persistent. It was here that Clara, a young woman with dreams too big for her small town, found herself lured by the promise of wealth and freedom. The madam, a striking woman with eyes like shards of obsidian, had approached her in a cafe. Her voice was honeyed, her words irresistible. "You'll be treated like a queen," she had said. "The clients are discerning but generous. You'll want for nothing." Clara, desperate and naive, had signed a contract without reading the fine print. At first, everything seemed perfect. The other workers, beautiful, ethereal women, moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces serene, their movements graceful. But there was something off about them. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices were hollow, their words clipped. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Clara tried to strike up conversations, but they would only stare at her, their gazes distant, as if they were looking through her. One night, as Clara wandered the halls, she heard a faint cracking sound, like the shattering of fine china. She followed the noise to a dimly lit room, its door slightly ajar. Inside, she saw one of the workers, a girl named Lila, standing motionless in front of a mirror. Clara called out to her, but Lila didn't respond. Then, with a sickening crunch, Lila's arm cracked, splintering like porcelain. Clara stifled a scream as Lila's face began to fracture, her skin peeling away to reveal a smooth, glossy surface beneath. Her eyes, once vibrant, now stared blankly, painted on and lifeless. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She ran to the madam's office, bursting in without knocking. The madam sat at her desk, her expression calm, almost amused. "Ah, Clara," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I suppose it's time you learned the truth." The madam explained that the clients of La Maison des Étoiles were not ordinary men. They were collectors, beings from a realm beyond human understanding, who coveted beauty in its most fragile form. The workers were not there to entertain. They were there to be transformed. One by one, they were turned into lifelike dolls, their humanity stripped away, their bodies made into perfect, unbreakable, until they weren't, works of art. The process was slow, insidious, a curse woven into the very fabric of the brothel. Clara's mind raced. She had to escape, but the madam's smile told her it was already too late. "You signed a contract, my dear," the madam said, holding up the paper Clara had so carelessly signed. "Your soul belongs to them now." That night, Clara felt the first signs of the transformation. Her skin began to harden, her movements growing stiff. She caught glimpses of her reflection in the mirrors, her face taking on a porcelain sheen. Desperate, she searched for a way out, but the brothel seemed to shift and change around her, its halls stretching into impossible lengths, its doors leading to nowhere. As the days passed, Clara noticed the other workers watching her, their painted eyes following her every move. They began to whisper, their voices echoing in her mind. "Join us," they said. "It's easier if you don't fight." But Clara refused to give in. She discovered a hidden passage behind a loose panel in her room, leading to a network of tunnels beneath the brothel. The air was damp and cold, the walls lined with shelves upon shelves of dolls. Former workers, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. At the end of the tunnel, Clara found a door. It was old and rusted, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. She pushed it open, revealing a chamber filled with the collectors. They were monstrous, their forms shifting and indistinct, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a doll that looked exactly like Clara. The madam appeared beside her, her voice a whisper in Clara's ear. "You see, there's no escape. You belong to them now." But Clara had one last trick up her sleeve. She had found a shard of broken mirror in the tunnels, and as the collectors closed in, she plunged it into her own chest. Pain seared through her, but instead of blood, a blinding light erupted from the wound. The collectors shrieked, their forms dissolving in the light. The brothel began to collapse around her, its opulent facade crumbling to reveal the rot beneath. When Clara awoke, she was lying in an alley, the city's neon lights flickering above her. The brothel was gone, as if it had never existed. But in her hand, she clutched a small porcelain doll, its face a perfect replica of her own. And in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of cracking, like the shattering of fine china. The curse was not broken. It had only begun. Clara stumbled through the labyrinthine streets of the city, the porcelain doll clutched tightly in her hand. Its smooth, cold surface seemed to pulse faintly, as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. The neon lights above flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach for her. She could still hear the faint cracking sound, echoing in her mind like a taunt. The brothel was gone, but its curse clung to her like a second skin. She returned to her small apartment, a dingy room with peeling wallpaper and a single flickering bulb. For days, she barely slept, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. The doll sat on her nightstand, its painted eyes staring at her, unblinking. She tried to throw it away, to burn it, but it always reappeared, pristine and untouched, as if it had never left. One night, as Clara lay in bed, she heard a soft, melodic humming. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. She turned to the doll and froze. Its head had tilted slightly, its lips parted as if mid-breath. The humming was coming from it. Clara's breath hitched. She reached out to touch the doll, her fingers trembling. The moment she made contact, a searing pain shot through her hand. She yanked it back, staring in horror as her skin began to harden, turning smooth and glossy. The transformation was spreading. Desperate, Clara sought answers. She scoured the city's darkest corners, seeking out occultists, fortune tellers, anyone who might know how to break the curse. In a dimly lit bookstore, she found an old man with milky eyes and a voice like gravel. He examined the doll, his expression grim. "This is no ordinary curse," he said. "The collectors are ancient beings, older than time itself. They feed on beauty, on the essence of life. Once they claim you, there's no escape." But he hesitated, his gaze narrowing. "There is one way. You must destroy the source of their power. The first doll. It's said to be hidden in the heart of their realm, a place between worlds." Clara's heart raced. "How do I find it?" The old man handed her a small, ornate key. "This will open the door, but be warned. The realm is a reflection of your deepest fears. Many have entered, but none have returned." That night, Clara stood before a bathroom mirror, the key in one hand and the doll in the other. She pressed the key to the glass, and the surface rippled like water. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through. The realm was a nightmare. The air was thick and suffocating, the ground a shifting mosaic of broken porcelain. The sky was a swirling void, dotted with glowing eyes that watched her every move. The dolls were everywhere, their lifeless faces twisted in agony. They reached for her, their brittle fingers snapping as they tried to grab her. Clara pressed on, guided by an unseen force. She reached a towering structure made entirely of dolls, their bodies fused together in a grotesque sculpture. At its peak was a pedestal, and on it sat the first doll. It was beautiful, its features delicate and perfect, but its eyes burned with a malevolent light. As Clara climbed the structure, the dolls began to awaken. They shrieked, their voices a cacophony of despair and rage. The ground beneath her cracked, threatening to swallow her whole. She reached the pedestal and grabbed the first doll, its surface burning her hands. "You think you can destroy me?" The doll hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. "I am eternal. I am beauty. I am despair." Clara hesitated, but then she remembered the shard of mirror she had kept. She plunged it into the doll's chest. Light erupted, blinding and searing. The realm began to collapse, the doll shattering into dust. Clara felt herself falling, the world around her dissolving into nothingness. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The doll on her nightstand was gone, and her skin was soft and warm once more. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. But as she stood to leave, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her reflection smiled, a cold, cruel smile that wasn't her own. And in the shadows behind her, she saw the faint outline of the first doll, its eyes glowing with triumph. The curse was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be passed on. The Crimson Bride. In the shadowed heart of the city, where the gaslights flickered like dying stars and the cobblestones glistened with rain, there stood a brothel known only as La Maison d'Ombres, the House of Shadows. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones, a sanctuary for the desperate and the damned. The women who worked there were bound by more than just their contracts. They were bound by secrets, by curses, and by a relic that had haunted the establishment for generations, the cursed silk veil. The veil was said to have been woven by the hands of a jilted bride, a woman whose name had been erased from history. Her story was one of betrayal and blood. On the eve of her wedding, her betrothed had abandoned her for another, leaving her to hang herself in her bridal gown. But death did not claim her entirely. Her spirit clung to the veil she had worn, a shroud of silk that promised beauty and wealth to any woman who dared to wear it. Yet, the promise came with a price paid in blood. The veil first appeared in the brothel one stormy night, delivered by a cloaked figure who vanished into the rain without a word. The madam, a sharp-eyed woman named Madame Colette, took it as a gift from a wealthy patron. She draped it over the shoulders of her newest girl, a wide-eyed beauty named Lisette, who had come to the city seeking fortune. Lisette marveled at the veil's delicate embroidery, the way it shimmered like moonlight on water. But as she tied it around her head, she felt a chill, a whisper against her skin, like the breath of a ghost. That night, Lisette stood before the mirror in her room, transfixed. The veil seemed to glow, casting an otherworldly light on her reflection. But something was wrong. Her reflection smiled at her, a smile she did not make. It beckoned her closer, its eyes dark and empty. Lisette's hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the razor on the vanity. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The reflection leaned in, whispering words in a language she did not understand. And then, with a swift, deliberate motion, she drew the blade across her throat. The next morning, Madame Colette found Lisette's body slumped before the mirror, the veil still draped over her lifeless form. The room reeked of iron and roses, a sickly sweet combination that made Colette's stomach churn. She removed the veil, her hands trembling, and locked it away in a chest in her office. But the veil did not stay hidden for long. One by one, the women of the brothel found themselves drawn to it. They would sneak into Colette's office, their eyes glazed, their movements jerky, as if pulled by invisible strings. Each time, the scene was the same. A woman standing before a mirror, the veil glowing like a halo, her reflection twisting into something monstrous. And then the blood. Always the blood. The brothel became a house of whispers and screams. The women who survived grew paranoid, locking their doors and avoiding mirrors. But the veil had a way of finding its victims. It would appear in their rooms, draped over their beds, or hanging from their wardrobes, as if it had a will of its own. Some tried to burn it, but the flames would not touch it. Others tried to bury it, but it always returned, pristine and untouched. One night, a new girl arrived at the brothel. Her name was Amelie, and she was different from the others. She had come not for wealth or beauty, but for answers. Her sister, a former worker at La Maison d'Ambers, had been one of the veil's victims. Amelie was determined to uncover the truth behind the curse and destroy the veil once and for all. Amelie's investigation led her deep into the brothel's history. She discovered that the veil had been brought to the house by a man who claimed to be a collector of rare artifacts. He had spoken of a bride who had died in despair, her spirit bound to the veil, seeking new brides to join her in the afterlife. The man had vanished soon after, leaving behind only a name, Le Marié, the groom. As Amelie delved deeper, she began to experience strange visions. She saw the bride, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. She saw the groom, a shadowy figure with a smile that dripped with malice. And she saw the brothel, not as it was, but as it had been centuries ago, a grand estate where the bride had lived and died. One night, Amelie found herself standing before the mirror in her room, the veil in her hands. She had not put it there. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of roses. Her reflection stared back at her, but it was not her own. It was the bride, her lips moving in a silent plea. Amelie felt the razor in her hand, its edge cold against her skin. She fought against the compulsion, her mind screaming for her to stop. But the veil's power was too strong. Just as the blade touched her throat, Amelie remembered something her sister had told her. The veil could only claim those who wore it willingly. With a surge of willpower, she tore the veil from her head and threw it to the ground. The room erupted in a cacophony of screams, the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces. The bride's face appeared in shards, her expression one of fury and despair. Amelie knew what she had to do. She gathered the pieces of the mirror and the veil, carrying them to the brothel's basement. There, she built a pyre and set it alight. As the flames consumed the veil, she heard the bride's voice, soft and sorrowful, thanking her. The curse was broken, but as Amelie turned to leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the groom, his face twisted in a snarl. "You may have freed her," he hissed, "but you cannot free yourself." Before she could react, he plunged a dagger into her heart. The next morning, the brothel was silent. The women found Amelie's body in the basement, the dagger still lodged in her chest. The veil was gone, reduced to ashes, but in its place, they found a new relic, a dagger, its blade etched with the same intricate patterns as the veil. And though they tried to destroy it, the dagger always returned, waiting for its next victim. For the curse was not truly broken. It had merely changed form, and in the shadows of La Maison d'Ambers, the groom still waited, his smile dripping with malice, his eyes fixed on the next bride. The brothel, La Maison d'Ambers, fell into an eerie silence after Amelie's death. The women, once bound by the veil's curse, now found themselves haunted by the dagger. It appeared in their rooms, on their pillows, or even in their hands as they awoke from restless sleep. The blade seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, its intricate patterns glowing faintly in the dark. The women whispered that it was alive, that it watched them, waiting. Madame Colette, desperate to rid the house of the curse, called upon a priest. But when the holy man arrived, he took one look at the dagger and fled, muttering about a darkness too ancient to be exorcised. The women began to leave, one by one, abandoning the brothel to its fate. Soon, only a handful remained, those too broken or too greedy to care about the danger. Among them was a woman named Claudette, a hardened veteran of the brothel who had seen it all. She had worn the veil once, years ago, and survived by sheer force of will. Now, she saw the dagger as a challenge. If it wants a victim, she said, it'll have to fight me for it. Claudette took the dagger and locked it in an iron box, burying it beneath the brothel cellar floor. For a time, the house was quiet, but the dagger was not so easily contained. One night, Claudette awoke to find the box on her bedside table, the lid open, the dagger gleaming in the moonlight. She reached for it, her hand trembling, and felt a surge of power. The dagger whispered to her, promising her freedom, wealth, and revenge against those who had wronged her. Claudette, ever the pragmatist, decided to use the dagger's power for her own gain. She began to manipulate the other women, sowing discord and fear. The brothel became a battleground, with Claudette at its center, the dagger in her hand. But the more she used it, the more it consumed her. Her reflection in the mirror began to change, her eyes growing darker, her smile sharper. The other women whispered that she was becoming something else, something not quite human. One night, Claudette stood before the mirror, the dagger in her hand. Her reflection smiled at her, but it was not her own. It was the groom, his face twisted in a grin. "You thought you could control me," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But you are mine now." Claudette tried to drop the dagger, but her hand would not obey. She watched in horror as the reflection stepped out of the mirror, the groom's form solidifying before her. He was tall and gaunt, his eyes black as coal, his smile a jagged gash across his face. He took the dagger from her hand and plunged it in her heart. The next morning, the women found Claudette's body, the dagger still lodged in her chest. But the groom was gone, and so was the dagger. The brothel seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if the curse had finally been lifted. But the women knew better. They could feel his presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Months passed, and the brothel fell into ruin. The remaining women left, and the building was abandoned. But the curse did not die. It spread, infecting the city like a plague. Women began to disappear, their bodies found in alleys and basements, their throats slit by an unseen hand. The dagger reappeared, always in the hands of a new victim, always whispering its promises of power and revenge. Years later, a young historian named Elodie arrived in the city, drawn by the legend of La Maison d'Ambers. She had heard the stories of the cursed veil and the dagger, and she was determined to uncover the truth. She tracked down the brothel, now a crumbling ruin, and began to explore its dark corridors. In the basement, she found the iron box, its lid rusted shut. Using a crowbar, she pried it open and found the dagger inside, its blade still gleaming as if it had been forged yesterday. As she reached for it, she felt a chill, a whisper against her skin, but she ignored it, driven by curiosity and ambition. Elodie took the dagger back to her apartment, where she began to research its origins. She discovered that the groom had been a nobleman, a man obsessed with immortality. He had made a pact with a dark entity, binding his soul to the dagger and his bride's soul to the veil. Together, they were cursed to claim new brides for him, their souls feeding his eternal life. But Elodie also found a way to break the curse. The dagger and the veil had to be destroyed together, their remains scattered to the winds. She tracked down the ashes of the veil, which had been kept by a former worker of the brothel, and prepared to perform the ritual. That night, Elodie stood in her apartment, the dagger and the ashes before her. She lit a fire and began to chant the words she had found in an ancient text. But as she reached for the dagger, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the groom, his face twisted in a snarl. "You cannot destroy me," he hissed. "I am eternal." Elodie, trembling but determined, plunged the dagger into the fire. The room erupted in a cacophony of screams, the flames turning black as the groom's form began to dissolve. But as he faded, he reached out and grabbed Elodie, pulling her into the fire with him. The next morning, the fire had burned out, leaving only ashes and a single, unbroken shard of the dagger. The curse was broken, but Elodie was gone, and in the shadows, a new relic waited, its form shifting, its purpose unclear. For the curse was not truly gone. It had merely changed form, and in the darkness, the groom still waited, his smile dripping with malice, his eyes fixed on the next victim. The end, or is it? The Whispering Room. The brothel, known as the Velvet Veil, was an ancient establishment tucked away in the darkest corner of the city. It had stood for centuries, its walls steeped in secrets, its ruins echoing with the whispers of countless patrons. Among them was a man known only as Mr. Blackwood. He was a regular, arriving every month like clockwork, always requesting the same room, room 13. The workers had grown accustomed to his peculiar habits. He always came alone, yet he whispered incessantly to someone unseen. His voice was low, urgent, as if engaged in a conversation with an invisible companion. The workers found it unsettling, but Mr. Blackwood paid handsomely, and in the Velvet Veil, money had a way of silencing curiosity. One fateful evening, a new worker named Lila was assigned to room 13. She was young, beautiful, and desperate for the money the brothel promised. The other girls warned her about Mr. Blackwood, their voices trembling as they spoke of his eerie presence. But Lila dismissed their fears. She had seen her share of strange men. How bad could he be? When Mr. Blackwood arrived, Lila was struck by his appearance. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as moonlight, his eyes hollow and distant. He wore a suit that seemed out of another era, its fabric frayed and discolored. As she led him to room 13, she noticed the air grow colder with each step. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber adorned with antique furniture and a large, dusty mirror. Mr. Blackwood sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the mirror. Lila tried to make conversation, but he ignored her, his lips moving in a silent whisper. She felt a chill run down her spine as the room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure beside him, its form shifting and indistinct, like smoke caught in a breeze. It leaned close to Mr. Blackwood, its presence radiating a malevolent energy. Lila's heart pounded as she backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an otherworldly cacophony. The shadowy figure turned its gaze toward her, and she felt an icy grip seize her chest. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed onto the floor, her strength draining away as if sucked out by an unseen force. When Lila awoke the next morning, she was alone in room 13. The mirror reflected her face, but it was no longer her own. Her once youthful features were now gaunt and wrinkled, her hair streaked with gray. She screamed, her voice hoarse and aged, as she realized the truth. The entity in the room had stolen years of her life. Desperate for answers, Lila confronted the brothel's Madame Celeste. The woman's face turned ashen as she listened to Lila's story. With a trembling hand, she unlocked a hidden drawer and pulled out an ancient ledger. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with names and dates stretching back over a century. "Mr. Blackwood," Madame Celeste whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been coming here since 1897. He died that year, but he never stopped visiting. He made a pact with something that feeds on life. Every month, he brings it here, and it takes what it needs. Lila's blood ran cold as she realized the horrifying truth. Mr. Blackwood was no ordinary client. He was a revenant, bound to the entity that had claimed his soul. The shadowy figure was a life drinker, a parasitic spirit that sustained itself by consuming the life force of the living. And now, it had marked Lila as its next victim. Determined to break free of the curse, Lila delved into the brothel's dark history. She discovered that Room 13 was built on the site of an ancient burial ground, its foundation imbued with dark magic. The life drinker had been summoned by a desperate man, Mr. Blackwood himself, who had sought immortality at any cost. But the price was steep. He was doomed to serve the entity for eternity, luring unsuspecting victims to their doom. Lila's investigation led her to an old priest who knew of the life drinker's curse. He gave her a talisman, a silver cross inscribed with ancient runes, and instructed her to confront the entity during the next full moon. It will be at its weakest then, he warned. But beware, if you fail, it will consume you completely. The night of the full moon arrived, and Lila returned to Room 13. The air was thick with tension as she placed the talisman on the mirror, its surface rippling like water. The shadows in the room began to writhe, coalescing into the form of the life drinker. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light as it lunged at her, but the talisman flared with a blinding radiance, forcing the entity back. Lila chanted the incantation the priest had taught her, her voice trembling but resolute. The life drinker shrieked, its form unraveling as the talisman's power surged. Mr. Blackwood appeared beside it, his face twisted in agony. "Please," he begged, his voice a hollow echo. "Release me." With a final, desperate cry, Lila shattered the mirror. The room was engulfed in a blinding light, and when it faded, the life drinker was gone. Mr. Blackwood's form dissolved into dust, his soul finally freed from the curse. But as Lila left Room 13, she noticed something strange. The talisman in her hand had cracked, its runes fading. The priest had warned her that breaking the curse would come at a cost. She felt a coldness settle in her chest, a lingering presence that whispered in the back of her mind. The life drinker was gone, but its mark remained, and in the mirror, her reflection smiled back at her, a smile that was not her own. Months later, the Velvet Veil reopened under new management. The workers spoke of a mysterious woman who now occupied Room 13. She was beautiful, ageless, and always alone. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear whispers coming from her room, whispers that sounded like two voices, one human, and one something else entirely. The Velvet Veil had always been a place of secrets, but after Lila's confrontation with a life drinker, the brothel took on an even darker aura. The workers avoided Room 13, now permanently locked and shrouded in rumors. The new madam, a cold and calculating woman named Ravenna, dismissed the stories as superstition. Business was business, and Room 13 was too valuable to remain empty. But Ravenna had her own secrets. She had purchased the brothel under mysterious circumstances, her wealth seemingly appearing overnight. She was fascinated by the occult, her private quarters filled with ancient tomes and strange artifacts. She had heard whispers of the life drinker and its power, and she saw an opportunity, a way to harness its energy for herself. One night, Ravenna unlocked Room 13. The air inside was heavy, the walls seeming to pulse with a faint, rhythmic thrum. She placed a black candle on the dusty dresser and lit it, the flame casting eerie shadows across the room. From her pocket, she withdrew a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Lila's blood, collected the night she had confronted the life drinker. Ravenna chanted in a language long forgotten, her voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The shadows in the room began to stir, coalescing into a familiar, shifting form. The life drinker had not been destroyed. It had been weakened, trapped within the shattered remnants of the mirror. And now, Ravenna was calling it back. The entity materialized before her, its form more solid than before. It loomed over her, its eyes glowing with a cold, calculating intelligence. "You dare summon me?" It hissed, its voice a guttural rasp. Ravenna stood her ground, her expression unflinching. "I offer you a deal," she said. "I will give you sustenance, a steady stream of lives to feed on. In return, you will grant me immortality." The life drinker tilted its head, considering her offer. It had been weakened by Lila's ritual, and it needed a host to regain its strength. Ravenna was ambitious, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to achieve her goals. She would make a perfect vessel. "Very well," the entity said, its voice dripping with malice. "But know this, the price of immortality is eternal servitude. You will never be free of me." Ravenna smiled, a cruel twist of her lips. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Meanwhile, Lila had fled the city, hoping to escape the curse that still lingered within her. But no matter how far she traveled, she could not shake the feeling of being watched. Her reflection in mirrors and windows seemed distorted, its movements slightly out of sync with her own. At night, she heard whispers in her dreams, the voice of the life drinker taunting her. "You cannot run from me," it said. "You are mine." Desperate, Lila sought out the old priest who had given her the talisman. She found him in a remote monastery, his health failing, but his mind still sharp. When she told him of Ravenna's actions and the life drinker's return, his face grew grim. "The life drinker is more powerful than I realized," he said. "It has bound itself to you, and now it seeks to bind itself to Ravenna. If it succeeds, it will become unstoppable." "What can I do?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The priest handed her a dagger, its blade inscribed with ancient symbols. "This is the blade of severance," he said. "It can cut the ties that bind the life drinker to this world. But to use it, you must strike at the heart of its power, the mirror in room 13. Destroy the mirror, and you will sever its connection to both you and Ravenna." Lila took the dagger, its weight heavy in her hand. "And if I fail?" The priest's eyes were filled with sorrow. "Then the life drinker will consume you both, and its power will grow until no one can stop it." Lila returned to the velvet veil, her resolve hardened. The brothel was bustling with activity, but she slipped inside unnoticed, her movements swift and silent. She made her way to room 13, her heart pounding as she approached the door. It was unlocked, the air inside thick with the scent of incense and decay. Ravenna stood before the mirror, her reflection distorted and twisted. The life drinker hovered beside her, its form more solid than ever. It turned to face Lila, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. Lila gripped the dagger tightly, her knuckles white. "This ends tonight." Ravenna laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're too late. The ritual is complete. I am immortal, and the life drinker is unstoppable." "We'll see about that," Lila said, lunging forward. The room erupted into chaos. The life drinker lashed out, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around Lila's arms and legs. Ravenna watched with a cruel smile, confident in her victory. But Lila fought back with everything she had, her determination fueled by the knowledge that this was her last chance. With a final, desperate effort, she broke free of the life drinker's grasp and plunged the dagger into the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the room filled with a blinding light. The life drinker let out an ear-piercing shriek as its form began to unravel, its connection to the world severed. Ravenna screamed, her body convulsing as the life drinker's power was ripped away. She collapsed to the floor, her once youthful features aging rapidly until she was nothing more than a withered husk. Lila fell to her knees, exhausted but victorious. The curse was broken, the life drinker vanished. But as she looked at the shattered remains of the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection was gone. The velvet veil was closed for good, its doors sealed and its secrets buried. But in the darkness of room 13, the shattered mirror began to reform, its pieces knitting together as if guided by an unseen hand. The life drinker was gone, but its essence lingered, waiting for the next desperate soul to summon it. And somewhere, in the shadows, Lila's reflection smiled, a smile that was not her own. The midnight special. The job posting had been vague, but the pay was too good to pass up. Intimate performer wanted for exclusive, private theater. Discretion guaranteed. The address led her to an unmarked building in the industrial part of the city, its windows blacked out, its entrance a single steel door with no handle. She hesitated, but desperation had a way of silencing doubt. She knocked, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of formaldehyde. A man in a tailored suit greeted her, his face unnervingly smooth, his voice a monotone. "Welcome," he said. "You'll perform here, behind the glass. The audience will watch. They are very particular. Do not speak to them. Do not touch the glass. Do your job, and you will be compensated handsomely." She nodded, though unease prickled at her skin. The room he led her to was small, lit by a single overhead bulb. One wall was a mirror, but she knew it was one-way glass. Beyond it, she imagined wealthy patrons sitting in plush chairs, their faces obscured by shadows. She had performed before, though never like this. Still, the money was enough to make her push aside her discomfort. The first night was uneventful. She danced, she posed, she performed. The audience was silent, motionless. She couldn't see them, but she felt their gaze, heavy and unblinking. When she finished, the man in the suit handed her an envelope stuffed with cash. "You did well," he said. They were pleased. The nights blurred together. The silence of the audience became unnerving, but the money kept her coming back. She began to notice strange details. The way the air smelled sharper, colder, the faint sound of creaking wood when she moved, the way the audience never shifted, never coughed, never breathed. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but the unease grew. One night, she arrived early. The building was empty, the man in the suit nowhere to be found. She wandered the halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found a door she hadn't noticed before, slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her. She pushed it open. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with rows of chairs. In each chair sat a figure, perfectly still. Her breath caught her throat. They were dressed in fine clothes, their faces eerily lifelike, but their eyes were glassy, unseen. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. They weren't people. They were mannequins. No, not mannequins. Taxidermied corpses, their skin preserved. Their eyes were placed with glass orbs that reflected the faint light. She stumbled back, ball rising in her throat. The audience she had been performing for, they were dead, preserved, watching her with those unblinking eyes. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. The man in the suit stood there, his expression unchanged. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, "but now that you have, you'll understand. The show must go on, forever." She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to close in around her, the glass-eyed audience staring, staring, staring. She felt hands on her shoulders, cold and unyielding. The man in the suit leaned close, his breath smelling of chemicals. "You'll make a beautiful addition to the collection," he whispered. Weeks passed, though time had lost all meaning. She was still alive, but barely. They kept her in a small room, feeding her just enough to keep her conscious. The man in the suit, She learned his name was Mr. Graves, visited her often, always with that same blank expression. "You're special," he told her one day. "Most performers only last a few nights before they deteriorate, but you've lasted longer than any of them. The audience adores you." She wanted to scream, to fight, but she was too weak. Instead, she asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why? Why do you do this?" Mr. Graves tilted his head, as if considering whether to answer. "The audience," he said finally, "they were once like you, performers, artists, dreamers, but they wanted immortality. They wanted to be remembered forever. And so, they made a deal. They gave up their lives to become part of the show. Eternal, unchanging, perfect." She stared at him, horrified. "And now you're doing the same to me." He smiled, a cold, lifeless smile. "Not exactly. You see, the audience, they grow restless. They crave something new, something alive. And you, my dear, will be the final act, the living among the dead, forever." The night of her performance arrived. They dressed her in a flowing gown, her hair styled, her face painted to look like a porcelain doll. She was led to the stage, the glass-eyed audience watching as always. But this time, she could see them clearly. Their faces were frozen in expressions of longing, of hunger. They wanted her. They wanted her to join them. The music began, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. She moved, not by choice, but because her body was no longer her own. The audience leaned forward, their glass eyes gleaming. She felt the cold hands of Mr. Graves on her shoulders again, guiding her, positioning her. And then she saw it, a figure in the back of the room, slumped in a chair. It was her, or what used to be her. Her skin was pale, her eyes glassy, her body stiff and lifeless. She realized with a jolt of terror that she was already one of them. The performance, the audience, the never-ending show. It had claimed her long before she knew it. The music swelled, the audience leaned closer, and she felt herself slipping away, her thoughts fading, her body becoming still. The last thing she saw was her own glass-eyed reflection, staring back at her, forever frozen in time. The show, after all, never ends. Months later, another desperate soul answered a vague job posting. The pay was too good to pass up. The building was unmarked. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, a man in a tailored suit greeted them, his face unnervingly smooth, his voice a monotone. "Welcome," he said. "You'll perform here, behind glass. The audience will watch. They are very particular." And somewhere, in the darkness, a pair of glass eyes gleamed with anticipation. The new performer, a young man named Daniel, stepped into the cold, dimly lit room. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, but he brushed it off as nerves. The man in the suit, Mr. Graves, had given him the same instructions as all the others. Perform, don't speak to the audience, don't touch the glass. The money was too good to question it. Daniel's first night was uneventful, though the silence of the audience unnerved him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him too intently, their gaze piercing through the one-way glass. When he finished, Mr. Graves handed him an envelope of cash and said, they were pleased. But Daniel wasn't like the others. He was curious, too curious. After his third performance, he began to notice the same strange details the woman before him had. The chemical smell, the creaking wood, the unblinking stillness of the audience. He decided to investigate. One night, after his performance, Daniel pretended to leave but hid in the shadows of the building. He waited until Mr. Graves locked up and disappeared into the depths of the theater. Daniel followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He found a hidden staircase leading down to a basement. The air grew colder, the smell of formaldehyde overwhelming. The basement was a labyrinth of corridors, each lined with doors. He opened one and froze. Inside was a workshop, Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of eyes, spools of thread, and tools he didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a table, and on that table was a body. It was the woman who had performed before him, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes replaced with glass orbs. She was being prepared for preservation. Daniel stumbled back, his mind racing. He opened another door and found rows of taxidermied figures, each dressed in fine clothes, their glass eyes staring blankly. The audience. They were here, waiting to be moved upstairs for the next performance. But the worst was yet to come. Daniel heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Mr. Graves standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," Mr. Graves said, his voice calm but menacing. Daniel backed away, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What are you doing to these people?" Mr. Graves tilted his head, his smooth face eerily still. "I told you, the audience craves something new, something alive. They were once performers, like you. They gave up their lives to become eternal, but they grow restless. They need fresh inspiration." Daniel's eyes darted to the tools on the shelves. "You're a monster." Mr. Graves smiled, a cold, lifeless smile. "No, Daniel, I'm an artist, and you will be my masterpiece." Daniel tried to run, but the door slammed shut. Mr. Graves moved with unnatural speed, grabbing him by the arm. Daniel struggled, but the man's grip was like iron. He was dragged to the table, where the woman's body still lay. "You'll join her," Mr. Graves said, "and together you'll perform for eternity." As Mr. Graves prepared his tools, Daniel noticed something strange. The taxidermied figures in the room, their glass eyes seemed to be following him. He blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but then one of them moved. Just a slight twitch of the head, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through him. "Did you see that?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. Mr. Graves paused, his expression flickering for the first time. "Silence," he hissed. "They're not supposed to wake yet." Daniel's eyes widened. "Wake? What do you mean, wake?" Before Mr. Graves could answer, a low creaking sound filled the room. The figures on the shelves began to move, their stiff limbs cracking as they shifted. Their glass eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and their mouths, frozen in eternal smiles, began to twitch. Mr. Graves dropped his tools, his calm demeanor shattered. No, it's too soon." The figures stepped down from the shelves, their movements jerky but deliberate. They surrounded Mr. Graves, their glass eyes fixed on him. He backed away, his face pale with fear. "You promised us eternity," one of them rasped, its voice dry and hollow. "But you lied. You kept us here, trapped, while you played God." Daniel watched in horror as the figures closed in on Mr. Graves. He tried to move, but his body was frozen in place. The woman on the table, her glass eyes turned to him, and she smiled. "Join us," she whispered. "The show must go on." Daniel woke to the sound of music. He was on the stage, dressed in a fine suit, his body stiff and unresponsive. The audience was there, their glass eyes watching him with rapt attention. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't obey. Mr. Graves was among them now, his face frozen in a look of terror. The woman stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She turned to Daniel and smiled. "Welcome to the show," she said. "It never ends." The music swelled, and Daniel felt himself moving, dancing, performing. The audience leaned forward, their glass eyes gleaming with delight. He was one of them now, trapped in an eternal performance, his soul bound to the theater forever. Months later, another desperate soul answered a vague job posting. The pay was too good to pass up. The building was unmarked. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, a man in a tailored suit greeted them, his face unnervingly smooth, his voice a monotone. "Welcome," he said. "You'll perform here, behind the glass. The audience will watch. They are very particular. And somewhere, in the darkness, a pair of glass eyes gleamed with anticipation. The show, after all, never ends. But the story doesn't end there. The theater itself was alive, a cursed entity that fed on the souls of the desperate. Mr. Graves had been its servant for centuries, luring performers to their doom. But now, with Mr. Graves gone, the theater needed a new curator. Daniel felt the pull of the curse, the weight of the audience's expectations. He tried to resist, but the theater's power was too strong. He became the new Mr. Graves, his face smoothing into that same blank expression, his voice becoming a monotone. And so, the cycle continued. The theater lured in new performers, the audience grew, and the show went on. Forever. Years later, a young woman stumbled upon the theater, drawn by the promise of easy money. She performed, she discovered the truth, and she tried to escape. But as she ran through the corridors, she found herself back on the stage, the audience watching her with their glass eyes. And standing in the shadows was Daniel, now the perfect image of Mr. Graves. He smiled that cold, lifeless smile and said, "Welcome to the show. It never ends." The woman screamed, but no one heard her. The music began, and she felt herself moving, dancing, performing. The audience leaned forward, their glass eyes gleaming with delight. The show, after all, never ends. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.